I will never forget the day I received my human. It was labeled as a gift, a well-intentioned gesture from a Xylarian business associate who, much like everyone else of late, had become enamored with the newcomers to the galactic scene. I'll admit to a flicker of curiosity. Humans fascinated my fellow xenopods. Messy, loud, with disconcertingly blunt appendages, they were the epitome of everything my ordered species found alarming. My associate, bless his rigidly organized heart, had likely intended to elevate my social standing. A human pet was the ultimate status symbol, a sign one was cosmopolitan enough to handle such a perplexing creature. I suspected he thought it might loosen me up a bit. He wasn't entirely wrong. Sarah, for I was provided a name, a curious string of sounds she responded to, was big. Her kind towered over me, all sharp angles and unpredictable swaying motions. Her skin was disconcertingly bare, save for a strange, tangled growth on the top of her head and peculiar coverings draped over her form. The most alarming were her frontal eyes, with their ability to track my movements so intently. I began what any good researcher would do: observation. My living quarters were woefully ill-equipped for a creature of her size. For the first few cycles, my carefully organized research notes became jumbled with panicked observations like, "Subject sleeps in a pile?" Emits high-pitched distress vocalizations upon viewing data pad. Investigation needed, and "Why is she licking the scientific specimens?" The first breakthrough, an accidental one, happened during a cleaning bot malfunction. The room whirred with its chaotic buzzing, and even I found it mildly distressing. In a burst of illogical panic, Sarah collided with me. My chitinous outer shell met her soft, yielding skin. It felt odd, not unpleasant, but a jolt ran through me, followed by a sense of pervasive warmth. The cleaning bot dispatched Sarah apparently possesses terrifying strength. When motivated, a strange ritual commenced. She extended a blunt appendage to me cautiously, vocalizing in soft, nonsensical tones. I, ever the scientist, froze, my translator struggling to make sense of her words. Timidly, I raised one of my own thinner appendages in response. Her hand enveloped it, a gentle pressure surrounding me. A wave of inexplicable calm washed over me, an almost purring hum vibrating deep in my thorax. I had never experienced anything like it. This, apparently, was the petting ritual. I decided it warranted further investigation. Sarah engaged in a series of illogical behaviors that utterly baffled my scientific mind. Her favorite activity involved throwing a brightly colored object she called a squeaky ball. She'd hurl it with impressive force, then chase after it with frantic enthusiasm, only to repeat the process endlessly. With meticulous care, I theorized this was a form of hunting practice. Perhaps the squeaky ball mimicked the behavior of a particularly elusive prey, and this elaborate ritual honed her skills in tracking and capture. I created elaborate charts, plotting trajectories, analyzing her retrieval methods, my antennae twitching with a thrill of potential discovery. Yet, bizarrely, she never once attempted to consume the object or showed any interest in the readily available, far more sensible food sources languishing nearby. Days of observation yielded no evidence supporting my nutritional hypothesis. My translator frustratingly labeled her vocalizations during this behavior with words like fun and play, concepts I found utterly perplexing. What possible advantage could be gained from expending energy for no tangible reward? Did this point towards a fatal flaw in their evolutionary survival instincts? I adjusted my focus. Perhaps whatever made humans so perplexing was the key to understanding their unexpected success within the galactic community. I was determined to unravel the mysteries of the squeaky ball. My breakthrough on the hyperspatial manifolds project had stalled. Weeks of promising data crumbled into a frustrating dead end. The elegant solution that had hummed in my mind seemed to slip away, just beyond reach. In xenopod society, displays of external distress are considered a sign of weakness. But alone in the privacy of my research chamber, I let out a soft chirp of despair, a vibration so minute I barely considered it a true vocalization. Yet Sarah reacted. She abandoned her relentless assault on the squeaky ball and padded over to me. Her intent gaze focused not on my datapads or the half-dismantled spatial calibrator, but on my faintly drooping antennae and the tightness in my thorax. Gently, she placed a warm hand on my chitinous shoulder. It was an uncharacteristic gesture from a being so fond of enthusiastic, full-body contact. Sarah vocalized in her usual, overly emotional manner, words the translator rendered as a jumble of okay and bad day. Most startling was the object she offered, a small, rectangular food item labeled as chocolate. Xenopods possess a rudimentary sense of taste compared to humans, but even I could tell this was a highly concentrated energy source, a stimulant. In this simple act, Sarah revealed a truth I'd been too focused on my own problems to see. Humans seem to possess a preternatural ability to read emotional states, to intuit the needs behind the external facade. This soft creature, seemingly devoted to frivolous activity, had displayed a depth of perceptive empathy I usually associated with my species' most revered elders. The station's emergency klaxons blared, a harsh intrusion on the usually tranquil hum of the habitat ring. Most xenopods reacted with a familiar fluttering of antennae, a surge of anxiety chemicals. We are, by nature, not a physically imposing species, and our survival instinct has always been to retreat, evaluate, and create a meticulous plan. Sarah did none of those things. I was trapped in a malfunctioning research chamber, cut off as automated safety protocols locked the doors. Through the viewport, I saw her surge through the panicking crowd, a blur of motion and distressed vocalizations. She slammed her blunt fists against the door, strength rippling through her form, until her voice turned raw with desperate cries. The sight terrified me just as much as the malfunction. Sarah, my gentle, playful Sarah, transformed. Gone was the easygoing creature obsessed with her squeaky ball. This was a warrior spirit unleashed, fueled by a raw, protective fury I would have never associated with her kind. Security arrived, drawn by her distress, and wrenched the doors open. I stumbled out, tremors racking my body. With a relieved cry, Sarah enveloped me in a crushing embrace, murmuring soft words of comfort. A human term floated into my translator, Mama Bear. I was still processing the strange reference to an ursine-like creature from their homeworld when the realization struck me with even more startling clarity. She had not acted out of pack instinct, but to protect me. It defied every evolutionary theory I held dear. Yet there it was undeniable evidence that humans, underneath their baffling behaviors, had a ferocious capacity for loyalty towards those they chose to include in their circle. I shivered, a thrill of something new and complex buzzing through my thorax. Perhaps they weren't so chaotic after all. Perhaps there was a primal order to their actions, just one I didn't fully understand yet. The work distress incident, as I came to think of it, had unexpected ripple effects. In the aftermath, Sarah kept a closer eye on me, seemingly attuned to the slightest slump in my antennae. This would have been unbearably intrusive, were it not for the way she integrated the monitoring into her usual routine. A break would be suggested, just as the equations began to swim before my eyes. The squeaky ball would come hurtling towards my workstation, accompanied by exaggerated panting and a hopeful wagging of her posterior. Initially, I resisted these interruptions. My work was serious, not to be abandoned for frivolous ball chasing. Yet odd things began to happen. After a particularly vigorous session of what Sarah enthusiastically termed fetch, I'd return to my data only to discover a fresh perspective on an old problem. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. But with increasing frequency, the solutions came not during intense laser focus on my research, but in the quiet moments after play when my mind was still loose and untroubled. Begrudgingly, I incorporated play breaks into my schedule, meticulously setting aside designated periods. I discovered something even more extraordinary. My hyperspatial manifolds project stalled not because of any flaw in my calculations, but because I had been approaching the problem with an overly rigid mindset. Sarah's haphazard, seemingly illogical actions planted a seed of doubt, causing me to question my own long-held assumptions. That questioning led to my scientific breakthrough. I shared my success with Sarah. She was so overcome, she emitted a loud, piercing vocalization, crushing me in another hug just before demolishing a celebratory feast of snacks. I learned to brace myself for these displays of enthusiastic affection. More importantly, I learned to appreciate the strange synergy of our interaction. My fellow xenopods watched my interaction with Sarah with wary fascination. We were an unlikely study in contrast, me with my meticulously organized chitin, my precise movements, and my quiet voice, and Sarah with her wild tangle of hair, her flailing gestures, and bursts of boisterous laughter. Yet my research progressed at an unprecedented rate. Colleagues hinted subtly, then not so subtly, about observing my methods. At first I hesitated. Was it wise to expose others to the sheer unpredictability of a human? But Sarah, ever eager to meet new beings, won them over with a combination of disarming smiles and relentless offers of snacks. The brave souls who participated in a session of fetch carefully supervised by myself came away looking both bewildered and intrigued. Timid inquiries became requests for introductions, then invitations to participate. Sarah proved remarkably adept at matching her energy levels to an individual xenopod's comfort zone. With gentle nudges and quiet coaxes, she drew out even my most reclusive colleagues from their meticulously organized shells. Soon, small pockets of playfulness started popping up in unexpected places. A group gathered around Sarah, learning the strange rules of one of her card games involving matching symbols and more exuberant shouting than a xenopod finds strictly necessary. Two previously stiff-backed researchers tentatively experimented with building blocks designed for human younglings. The sight was so utterly absurd that, to my own astonishment, I felt a chitter of amusement. Sarah grinned, her eyes sparkling with a triumphant gleam. Sarah encountered her own challenges in adapting to station life. The protocols and regulations designed for multiple species with varying needs were not structured with humans in mind. Forms had to be adjusted to accommodate her peculiar writing style, a series of looping scrawls rather than the precise input of most species. Her need for frequent hydration breaks interrupted meetings. Worst of all, the food replicator was consistently baffled by her requests for items involving spice, a culinary concept so intense it sent mild tremors through even my translator device. It became my turn to intervene. Citing the undeniable increase in efficiency and breakthroughs brought about by Sarah's presence, carefully avoiding mentioning squeaky balls and belly rubs in my official reports, I advocated for small changes. Timers were adjusted to allow for human-compatible breaks. Food options timidly expanded to include items labeled low-medium spice intensity. Sarah beamed at me, proclaiming me her favorite little bug dude in front of a high-ranking committee. I maintained decorum outwardly, but my antennae twitched with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Watching Sarah butt heads with the rigid station bureaucracy gave me a surprising new perspective on my own kind. I had always prized our order, our adherence to logic and routine. But there was such vibrancy in Sarah's messiness, her willingness to question, to push, to loudly advocate when something felt wrong. It was invigorating. My translator still stumbles over the complexities of human language. There's simply no adequate xenopod equivalent for the concept she calls love. The closest approximation is a combination of deep respect, a sense of protective responsibility, and the gentle hum of contentment I experience when in her company. But even those words feel insufficient. If I attempt to pinpoint why this unusual creature occupies such a place within my thorax, it boils down to several factors. First is her sheer, boundless energy. It's a kinetic force unlike anything I've witnessed. She vibrates with enthusiasm, diving into every activity, be it solving complex puzzles or belting out tuneless songs at a startling volume, with unwavering gusto. This energy is infectious, shaking me out of my ingrained tendency towards contemplative analysis. Then there's the depth of her loyalty, a protective instinct that goes beyond simple species-related pack behavior. She guards not just with physical strength, but with an emotional ferocity that took me utterly by surprise. I see it in the way her eyes narrow when a careless comment causes my antennae to droop, or the flash of determination when she advocates for changes to accommodate my needs. Perhaps most endearing are the bursts of joy she finds in the seemingly mundane. A shaft of sunlight hitting a discarded data crystal, the satisfying crunch of a snack, mastering a particularly tricky ball toss. All of it fills her with a delight that ripples outwards. Her happiness has a way of dislodging my own tightly wound anxieties. And finally, there's the simple fact of her utter acceptance of me. She doesn't try to change my nature. She embraces my xenopod quirks, patiently endures my stumbling attempts at her language, and finds genuine delight in my meticulously constructed charts, even if she playfully teases me about my obsession with them. It's a level of unconditional acceptance I rarely received even from my own kind. Sarah has irrevocably altered the way I perceive my own carefully ordered world. Through her, I've begun to question my long-held beliefs about efficiency, about the value of logic over messy enthusiasm. More surprisingly, she's awakened a dormant part of me, a part that, under her gentle coaxing, can find an unexpected and illogical delight in the simple act of chasing a brightly colored object. I am not merely more efficient, more engaged because of her. I believe, in the way a good scientist believes in irrefutable data, that I am also more content with her presence in my life. In the end, it boils down to this: she is not my pet, I am hers. It's a realization that came gradually, a subtle shift in power dynamics that occurred so organically I only noticed it in retrospect. Sarah feeds me, bathes me, a process I still resist with squeaks of indignity, shelters me, and dedicates a surprising amount of time and attention to my well-being. It stretches the definition of what a pet owner does. Yet there's no denying that she is the leader in this unlikely little symbiotic unit we've formed. My days revolve around her rhythms. I've become attuned to the subtle shifts in her emotions, and I offer counsel based on my knowledge of intergalactic protocol. The business associate who gifted me Sarah likely envisioned a different scenario. Me, the brilliant xenopod researcher, elevated further with my exotic, compliant pet. What has happened instead is far more profound. She's not a status symbol, but a force of nature, reshaping my world and expanding my understanding of the universe in ways I never could have predicted. I've taught her about xenopod social dynamics, the complexities of interstellar trade agreements, and the delicate art of multi-species diplomacy. In return, she's taught me about laughter, the fierce beauty of protectiveness, and the simple power of a well-timed belly rub. Perhaps the humans haven't risen to galactic prominence through superior technology, intelligence, or cunning military strategy. Maybe it's something far more potent: their ability to inspire, to disrupt, to break the molds we cling to, and reveal something far more vibrant underneath. My fellow xenopods are slowly coming around to the idea they may even begin acquiring their own humans soon. Though the station maintenance staff will surely revolt at the added mess, a small price to pay, perhaps, for the unexpected joy they bring. As for me, I am content to be Sarah's favorite bug dude, even if it means occasionally abandoning my research in favor of chasing a squeaky ball. It is, as she would say, totally worth it. The intergalactic tradition of the gift exchange had always been a source of mild bemusement for me. It served its intended purpose, facilitating diplomatic relationships through gestures of goodwill, but the selection process itself was often fraught with misunderstandings. What was deemed a treasure on one world was considered an oddity, or worse, an insult on another. Yet Sarah was uncharacteristically excited by the news, bouncing with an energy I usually associated with a particularly vigorous squeaky ball session. "Rix," she declared, her eyes gleaming, "you're going to help me pick out the perfect gift." I immediately prepared a short list of the finest xenopod research specimens, meticulously preserved and packaged to emphasize their scientific significance. Surely any intelligent being would be honored to receive such a display of intellectual achievement. Sarah, however, frowned at my presentation. No, something more personal," she said with an impatient wave of her hand. "Something from me, you know." This is where the concept began to break down. Humans, I'd observed, were strangely attached to objects lacking in any practical use. Their living quarters brimmed with decorative pillows which impaired efficient sleeping posture, small figurines representative of their mythical creatures, and puzzlingly framed images of themselves alongside other humans. Reluctantly, I accompanied her on a bewildering excursion through the station's commercial zone. She lingered among stalls filled with woven fabrics of questionable practicality, tiny metal objects designed to be worn as adornment, and a frankly alarming array of scented substances they applied to their skin. My translator struggled to provide context, rendering terms as cute, fun, and meaningful descriptors I found utterly useless. Desperation was setting in when a flash of color caught my eye. Nestled on a cluttered shelf was an object so inexplicably familiar, I almost chittered in recognition. larger and cruder than those created in my own laboratories, yet undeniably similar, a model of the hyperspatial manifolds that had been my life's work. It seemed such an odd choice for interspecies gifting, yet looking at it, an uncharacteristic warmth filled me. Sarah, ever attuned to the slightest shift in my antennae, noticed. "You like this? I mean, it's kind of weird, but—" I cautiously touched the colorful representation of my equations. "It resonates," was all I could manage. Sarah beamed. To my astonishment and the vendor's obvious delight, she purchased the manifold model. Later, carefully tucked within layers of protective cushioning, I watched as Sarah presented it to the visiting dignitary, explaining not the complex physics it represented, but instead its role in our unlikely friendship. The dignitary, a scaly Targan with a notably prickly temperament, let out a low, rumbling chuckle that had their translator device glitching in confusion. It was, according to Sarah, a sound of approval. Leaving the bewildering exchange, I realized perhaps I'd misjudged the entire purpose of the gift exchange. It wasn't merely knowledge or status traded, but the forging of a connection, illogical and intangible as that may seem. Sarah had a disconcerting habit of bringing food into my research chamber. The station had dedicated dining areas, spaces specifically designed to contain the messiness of multi-species consumption. Yet she would arrive bearing strange concoctions, carefully balancing precariously stacked plates and containers with a dexterity that defied the laws of physics. "Just a little snack break, Rixie," she'd declare, and deposit her offerings at a safe distance from my precious data pads, a precaution learned after a particularly unfortunate incident involving a substance called salsa. Initially, I considered these intrusions a disruption. My kind subsisted on bland but highly efficient nutrient pellets, consumed during allotted periods. The human concept of eating for pleasure was utterly illogical. Yet the scents wafting from the containers were intrusive. My antennae twitched involuntarily, picking up notes of sugary sweetness, strange spicy undertones, a combination both confusing and subtly alluring. And Sarah, with her uncanny ability to read emotional states, I didn't fully understand myself, would extend an offering. "Just a bite. Come on, you can do it." In a moment of weakness, and to put an end to her relentless coaxing, I succumbed. The first taste was a shock to my system. A burst of something called cinnamon exploded on my tongue, followed by a wave of sweetness tempered by an odd creamy texture. She watched with eager anticipation as I processed this new sensory information. In defiance of all my preconceptions, it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, there was a peculiar satisfaction in the lingering warmth of that unexpected flavor combination. Sarah let out a victorious whoop, as though I had just solved a particularly complex astrophysics equation. From that day forward, our shared meal breaks became a ritual. I discovered she had an almost preternatural ability to pick out foods that were strangely enticing to my xenopod palate. We would sit cross-legged on the floor of my labme, with a protective sheet carefully placed beneath me, and she'd share these odd delicacies while I meticulously sampled. In return, I'd offer her a perfectly balanced nutrient pellet, which she'd gamely attempt to eat while making faces that, according to my translator, signified a mixture of amusement and mild disgust. It was during one of these shared meals that a startling revelation hit me. This strange, joyful ritual signified something deeper than mere sustenance. It was about connection, sharing an experience, even with our vastly different taste preferences. I was participating in an act deeply embedded in human culture, one I barely began to understand, but undeniably enjoyed. One of the greatest frustrations in living with Sarah is her language. My translator works admirably on concrete nouns and technical specifications, but struggles immensely with the nuance of emotional descriptors. Terms like happy, sad, and angry came with general equivalents in my own tongue, but humans seem to possess an endless vocabulary for minute variations of those states. They were frustrated, disgruntled, annoyed, miffed, and an astounding number of other synonyms for mild irritation alone. Compounding the issue was Sarah's tendency to communicate indirectly. A xenopod expressing concern may gently touch an antennae, a signal easily interpreted across species. Sarah, in contrast, would ask, "Want a cup of tea?" or "How about we watch a funny video?" initially leading my translator to interpret these as a beverage request and entertainment preferences. It took months of careful observation, supplemented by awkwardly direct questioning. Sarah, when you ask if I wish for a nap, is this code for detecting signs of exhaustion in a manner considered socially polite by humans? To begin deciphering the patterns, a tilt of her head, a slight tightening around the eyes, the increased frequency of her offering snacks. All these were indicators not easily captured by mechanical translation. The true turning point, however, came after a particularly disastrous presentation to the Xenopod Scientific Council. My proposal for radical restructuring of the galactic trade route optimization protocols was met with resounding disapproval. Apparently, my meticulously presented data was undermining centuries of established tradition. It turns out the human language of emotion, for all its frustrating imprecise vocabulary, has a directness I never considered. It didn't reside in the words alone, but the intent, the shared vulnerability, the gentle touch of her hand on mine. For the first time, I understood her earlier offers of tea and funny videos. They weren't attempts to distract me, but rather wordless invitations to express my distress in a way that felt culturally familiar, safe. Humans are a tactile species. This I observed early on, noting how they embraced, clasped shoulders, and engaged in a baffling ritual called the high five after even the most minor of achievements. Physical contact was so ingrained into their interactions, it was a constant source of mild anxiety on my part. Xenopods, while social creatures, have a much stronger concept of personal space. We touch antennae briefly in greeting or express concern with a delicate brush of fingertips. However, Sarah was enthusiastic. Her hugs threatened to crack my chitinous shell, while a friendly pat on the shoulder sent shockwaves through my system. "You're so tense, Rixie Bug," she'd exclaim, her perception yet again outstripping my own self-awareness. "Relax those. Are those mandibles?" Her fingers would reach out before I could fully retreat, a gentle brush of soft skin against far more rigid chitin. It was, admittedly, an oddly pleasant sensation, followed almost immediately by the panic of potential cross-species contamination. Then came the day she declared her intent to run an experiment. I braced myself for flashing lights and the smell of ozone, fearing she would bring in a scanning device to determine the biological impact of her touch. Instead, she led me to the soft nest-like structure humans used for sleep and directed me to lie down. Hesitantly, I complied, my segmented body protesting the unfamiliar position. The room was dimmed, filtering out the usual harsh station lighting, and Sarah settled beside me. A moment of horrifying tension followed as I anticipated the inevitable full-body hug. She did touch me, but with a gentleness unlike anything I had experienced before. Her fingers traced the ridges of my thorax, followed the contours of my antennae. There was a fascination in her touch, a sense of exploration, and utterly without the overwhelming force I'd come to associate with her usual physical displays of affection. My translator sputtered with strange descriptions, tingly, warm, soothing. I found myself unable to focus on the inadequate words, only the sensation itself, the discovery of a type of touch that didn't frighten, but instead brought a peculiar wave of deep calm. Sarah, sensitive to the slightest shift in my posture, murmured a quiet, "Like this?" It was a strange reversal of our usual dynamic, the scientist now the subject, and the enthusiastic human the cautious observer. When the experiment concluded, I wasn't scanned or prodded, only offered a soft smile and something called fuzzy socks which, while sartorially baffling, provided a lingering warmth against my lower limbs. The next time Sarah perceived tension in my mandibles, she didn't launch into a full frontal hug, but instead reached out with a single hand, a gesture I had come to interpret as a wordless question. "May I?" It was something I was still learning to express for myself, but her gesture created the space for my consent. Xenopods are known for meticulous categorization. Our researchers diligently file away every new discovery, every intergalactic species encountered, into neatly labeled and subdivided sections within our vast knowledge archives. Humans, it seems, defy such easy classification. It began with a simple identity scan required for access to a new research wing on the station. I dutifully presented Sarah for the procedure, waiting for the system to slot her into the usual sentient mammalian bipedal category. The scanner word clicked, then blinked in confusion. Unknown species subtype, the automated voice echoed. Please consult a xenoclassification specialist. Sarah, rather than expressing concern, threw back her head and roared with laughter. This, unfortunately, further confused the system, which began to emit a low warning signal. At that juncture, a beleaguered-looking Florian, the designated xenoclassification specialist, intervened, squinting at Sarah and muttering to themselves. Bipedal, carbon-based, omnivorous diet, highly adaptable. No fur, minimal non-functional tail. Their antennae twitched in a manner indicative of mounting frustration. Finally, they announced their verdict to the scanner, overriding the automated protest. Species, human. Subtype, honorary xenopod. Notes, symbiotic bond present. Potential for illogical behavior. Proceed with caution. Sarah beamed and promptly proclaimed me her favorite non-bug dude, much to the Florian's dismay. As we left, I observed that her identity card now carried the perplexing label, further embellished with hand-scrawled notes denoting a penchant for squeaky balls and belly rubs. It was both absurd and, strangely, a point of pride. In the following weeks, I discovered how easily the concept of honorary xenopod caught on. My fellow researchers, while initially baffled by Sarah's presence among them, grew accustomed to her enthusiastic cheers during successful experiments, the sudden appearance of snacks during long hours of data analysis, and her unwavering belief in their capabilities, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. The honorary xenopod designation, conceived as a bureaucratic stopgap measure, became something more. It spoke of a willingness to adapt our rigid systems, to acknowledge that the lines between species weren't always clearly defined. It was an implicit recognition that Sarah, with all her joyful chaos and unwavering loyalty, offered something unique and valuable to our community, something that transcended simple biological classification. Humans, with their short lifespans and strong attachment to places, are prone to a condition they call homesickness. My initial research had categorized it as a form of separation anxiety, triggered by removal from a familiar habitat. Yet Sarah's case manifested in peculiar ways. Nostalgia for Earth was understandable. Their home world was remarkably lush compared to the sterile environment of the station. But Sarah's most intense bouts of longing would be triggered by seemingly mundane occurrences. The scent of something called pine needles carried on the air filtration system, a vid recording of a bizarre weather phenomenon called snow, even the sight of a particularly fluffy cloud formation. Her usual exuberant energy would ebb, replaced by a quiet wistfulness. She'd seek out physical contact more frequently and curl into herself during her sleep cycle. My translator became a jumble of words like yearning, ache, and missing, concepts that defied my understanding. Logically, the solution was simple: return her to her homeworld. Yet, observing her interactions on the station, it became clear that her bond went beyond her species and planet. There was a pack here as well, myself included, and the thought of her departure triggered a low hum of distress within me I couldn't fully explain away with xenopod social instincts. The breakthrough came during a late-night stroll through the station's underutilized arboretum zone. Drawn by soft sounds, I discovered Sarah seated amongst the vibrant flora, her form barely visible in the dim light. She wasn't weeping or emitting vocalizations of despair, but something in the droop of her shoulders conveyed a depth of emotion I had rarely witnessed. Hesitating only slightly, I settled beside her. "Tell me about snow," I said, startling with the uncharacteristic softness of my own voice. In the gentle light filtering through the foliage, she spoke, not of the science behind Earth weather patterns, but of the sensation of snow on her skin, the hush of a winter landscape, the peculiar joy of a clumsily constructed snow creature. As she described scenes utterly alien to me, a realization sparked. Homesickness wasn't about the place itself, but the web of sensations, experiences, and connections woven into the fabric of that place. The solution wasn't to send Sarah away, but to bring bits of home to her. The first step was data acquisition. Sarah, still touched by my concern, happily supplied a seemingly endless stream of information about Earth and its peculiar human customs. Her descriptions were often disorganized, jumping from favorite foods to childhood games to obscure festivals involving painted eggs and a mythical gift-giving figure. To organize this chaos, I employed the same meticulous methods I used for classifying stellar phenomena. Charts blossomed on the walls of my quarters, color-coded and cross-referenced, detailing everything from atmospheric composition to the significance of various holidays. Armed with a deeper understanding, I began the delicate task of interspecies collaboration. The gruff Targan engineer, initially startled by my inquiries about atmospheric controls, proved surprisingly resourceful when presented with the challenge of replicating specific humidity levels. A timid botanist from a methane-rich world, fascinated by Sarah's descriptions of flowers, helped me source surprisingly hardy earth flora for the Arboretum zone. Even the station's resident chef, a notoriously ill-tempered Spixian, grumbled his way into begrudging cooperation, muttering about expanding his culinary horizons while experimenting with strange flavor combinations Sarah dubbed pancakes. Bit by bit, we transformed a corner of the Arboretum. Temperature and air composition were subtly altered within safe parameters, vibrant earth plants filled previously barren planters, and the sound system discreetly played recordings of Sarah's descriptions of birdsong and rainfall. Then came the riskiest part, introducing the concept of Earth seasons to my change-averse fellow xenopods. With carefully prepared presentations highlighting the potential mental stimulation of a varied environment, I secured a temporary test period. The day we invited Sarah into the transform zone was one of quiet anticipation. She stepped through the doorway, and her usual cheerful chatter faded. Eyes wide, she surveyed the profusion of greenery, touched a dewdropped leaf, inhaled the unfamiliar floral scents. Then a soft sound, something between a laugh and a sob, escaped her. "Rixie," she whispered, it feels like home." That evening, with her usual exuberance back tenfold, she organized what she termed a fall festival in the newly christened Earth Zone. My antennae twitched in alarm as she strung up brightly colored leaves, produced a bewildering array of foods containing a spice known as pumpkin, and insisted everyone try a baffling activity called bobbing for apples. Yet, the laughter echoing through the station was undeniable. Humans, I realized, had a unique talent for sharing joy, for transforming a space into a feeling. The success of Operation Earth created a ripple effect. Initially, my fellow xenopods eyed Sarah with a mix of apprehension and amusement. But as my research continued unhindered, as Sarah's energy sparked new collaborative breakthroughs, curiosity began to eclipse long-held skepticism. Xenopods, for all our love of order and predictability, are also an intellectually driven race. The idea of a being so radically different enhancing our lives was too intriguing to ignore. Inquiries started tentatively. A request for instruction on this strange fetch game, careful questions about the flavors of Earth cuisine, expressions of interest in the peculiar human celebrations meticulously documented on my charts. Sarah, with her open nature and boundless enthusiasm, welcomed them all. Soon, small groups of xenopods shadowed her daily routines, learning through observation alongside my own note-taking. To my surprise, I became an unlikely consultant on the Xenopod Pet Initiative, a semi-formal and rather begrudgingly approved station program exploring interspecies cohabitation. Sarah was appointed ambassador, her unique ability to understand both human needs and xenopod sensibilities proving invaluable. The first few pairings were tentative, filled with misunderstandings and a few incidents involving a Spixian researcher's delicate antennae and a human's overenthusiastic hug. Yet there were also breakthroughs, a shared moment of awe when a human's boisterous laughter startled a colony of reclusive bioluminescent beings into illuminating their enclosure, an unexpected collaborative breakthrough sparked by a human-xenopod disagreement over optimal workspace temperatures. While I had initially viewed Sarah as my pet, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. We were a team, and my role evolved. I became the bridge, the translator, the cautious advocate pushing back against both rigid xenopod protocols and the occasional chaotic suggestions from our human colleagues. The news reached the station with the cold precision of a bureaucratic transmission. Sarah's time amongst us had come to an end. A family situation, something labeled as urgent, required her immediate presence back on Earth. I had known humans were a short-lived species, and yet the reality of her departure sent a shock of distress through me. My fellow xenopods, now accustomed to a level of vibrancy I had long forgotten, expressed a mix of confusion and sadness. Sarah, ever the optimist, flitted between them like a brightly colored comet, dispensing hugs, reassurance, and a trail of partially consumed snacks in her wake. Her whirlwind of activity intensified as the departure hour neared, yet it masked a forced cheer that even my translator couldn't fully disguise. The night before she left, Sarah found me in my research lab. Data streams flickered across my screens, a half-hearted attempt at normalcy. "Hey, Rixie," her voice held an undercurrent of a hesitancy that set my antennae on edge. I wanted to. Humans are terrible at goodbyes. Their language tangles itself in half-finished sentences and awkward expressions of emotion far too intense for their own comfort. In that moment, I felt a surge of unexpected empathy for the struggles my translator faced daily. I cut through the awkwardness in the most xenopod way possible. "Your departure from the station will have significant consequences. Loss of efficiency is probable. Innovative problem-solving rates will decrease. Also, and this was the hardest part, I will miss your company." Sarah blinked back tears, then did a very human thing. She laughed, a wet, slightly hysterical sound that held no joy. Then, seemingly unable to bear the formality anymore, she enveloped me in a hug that sent a jolt of panic-tinged warmth through my body. Her scent, usually a background hum, filled my senses, a sharp reminder of what I was about to lose. "You're my favorite bug, dude," she whispered. "Don't you forget that." The next day, the usually sterile departure lounge echoed with bewildered squeaks, roars of laughter, and the distinct scent of a suspiciously large quantity of chocolate. My fellow xenopods formed a line, each offering Sarah a farewell in their own manner. Timid waves, an offering of translated inspirational verse, even a slightly soggy Spixian delicacy. These creatures, who had once barely tolerated Sarah, were now expressing something akin to genuine affection. Then it was my turn. In my most precise hand gesture, I placed the datapad into her waiting hands. Years of meticulous observations, cross-reference charts, every squeaky ball trajectory and snack preference documented within. "This will optimize your reintegration process upon return to your home world," I managed, the words tight in my thorax. Sarah hugged me again, a whirlwind of warmth, sadness, and the lingering scent of cinnamon. Then she was gone. I returned to my lab, the silence roaring around me. Cycles passed. The station returned to its usual rhythm, but with an undercurrent of something undeniably altered. The Earth zone remained, a thriving pocket of vibrant green. Xenopods lingered longer after meetings, exchanging anecdotes or sharing a meal in a manner they rarely did before. My research continued, now aided by a team who had begun incorporating the unexpected, the playful, into their own rigid methodology. And yes, efficiency levels did temporarily dip in Sarah's absence, but the breakthroughs that followed surpassed anything achieved through rote orderliness alone. My data logs continued on a smaller scale. I tracked communications from Earth, messages from Sarah filled with descriptions of strange weather, complaints about not enough snacks, and inquiries on whether her xenopod friends missed her. The answer, I always confirmed, was a resounding affirmative. One day, amongst the updates, a peculiar object arrived, a small, crudely fashioned model representing my hyperspatial manifolds. The colors were far too bright, the proportions slightly off, but it sat in a place of honor in my quarters, a strange, tangible link to my absent human. Then, a transmission that caused even my translator to flicker in surprise. Sarah was returning, not as a visitor, but as a permanent resident. A flurry of forms followed, filled with terms like Xeno-Human Habitat Initiative and Interspecies Cohabitation Ambassador. My antennae twitched with a combination of anticipation and mild trepidation. Change, even positive change, was a disruption. Yet the station wasn't the same ordered, predictable place I had once prided myself on maintaining. The day she returned, the departure lounge teemed with life. I stood with my colleagues, a collection of beings as diverse as the station itself, all waiting with a warmth I would have once found unfathomable. When Sarah stepped through the portal, the roar of welcome that went up threatened to shake the station's very foundations. From a distance I observed the hugs, the joyful shouts, the way she radiated a kinetic energy that drew everyone in her orbit. Yes, there would be chaos, there would be misunderstandings, and likely a whole new level of bureaucratic forms that would make even a Florian's antennae twitch, and yet it was undeniably better this way. She spotted me, my chitinous shell hardly standing out amidst the crowd, and her smile widened. I offered a xenopod greeting, a single antenna raised in welcome. She paused, a considering look on her face, then carefully mirrored the gesture. We had learned much from one another, my human and I. Later, in the quiet of my lab, there would be reports to file, adjustments to make, and an influx of new humans to observe, recruited, it seems, by Sarah's enthusiastic tales. But for the moment, I allowed myself the simple, illogical pleasure of anticipating the joyful whirlwind that was about to disrupt my carefully ordered life once more.